He wasn't looking for anything that day, not a home, not a child, and certainly not a wife. He'd ridden through 37 towns and didn't remember half their names. But in Dust Creek, a girl no taller than his wagon wheel stepped into the road and changed everything. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears. Her voice trembled, but her words did not. "Please marry my mama, mister. She's all I've got left." And just like that, James Rowan forgot where he was going and started to remember what it meant to stay. The sun above Dust Creek burned like God had struck a match and walked away. Heat shimmered on the horizon, bending the distance like lies, and dust coiled behind James Rowan's wagon as his team of horses slowed to a wary halt. There was a girl in the road, barefoot, freckled, hair the color of dry wheat twisted into something like a braid. She couldn't have been more than 9, but she stood there like she was 30, like she'd made up her mind, and no man or thunderhead could shake it. James blinked beneath the brim of his sweat-stained hat, wiped a hand across the back of his neck, and swung down from the wagon. The horses huffed, restless. His boots hit the dirt with a dull, final thud. "You all right there, kid?" he asked. She didn't answer, just stared up at him with green eyes sharp as flint. "My name's Ellie Collins," she said, voice flat as the land around them. "And I need you to marry my mama." James blinked again, slower this time. A bead of sweat rolled past his temple. "Say that again." The girl squared her shoulders like she was about to be whipped and didn't want to flinch. "My mama's sick, real sick, and Mr. Kessler says if we don't pay him by Sunday, he'll throw us out, or worse. But if she had a husband, he might back off." It wasn't the words that broke James. It was how carefully she'd chosen them, like she'd rehearsed. Like this wasn't the first stranger she'd asked. Behind her, a weathered cabin leaned against the heat like it might collapse from the weight of its own silence. And in the doorway, a figure stood thin, hollowed out, red hair pinned in a bun that had once been proud, but now just tried to keep her together. She coughed, once, twice, and pressed a hand to the frame to stay standing. "Ellie," the woman called. Her voice cracked. "Get back inside." But Ellie didn't move. Her eyes were still on James, fierce and begging all at once. He let out a slow breath, unsure why his heart had started to ache. "Miss Collins," he said, turning toward the woman. "I reckon I should introduce myself. Name's James Rowan. Just passing through." She stepped forward, lips pale, back straight like she was fighting off shame. Evelyn Collins. "I'm sorry for whatever nonsense my daughter—" "It's not nonsense," Ellie snapped. "Mama, he's not like the others." James turned back to the girl, amused despite himself. "Others," she nodded solemnly. "I've been watching. The men who come through town, they drink, or stink, or curse at their horses. You don't do that. You talk to your horses like they're people." He blinked. "I do." Ellie nodded. "You called that big one Hank just 5 minutes ago. You said, 'Steady now, Hank, don't let the sun fry your brains.'" James chuckled in spite of himself. "Well, Hank's a sensitive soul." Evelyn sighed, stepping between them. Her cheeks had gone red, but her hands were trembling. "Please forgive her," she said. "We're not in the business of proposing to strangers on the road. She's just scared." Ellie looked up at James, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not scared, desperate." And James Rowan, who had faced gunmen, bandits, storms that turned riverbeds to death traps, found himself suddenly more afraid of this child's hope than any of those things. "I don't know what you're asking of me, Miss Collins," he said, finally, gently. "But it sounds like you and I ought to talk somewhere out of this sun." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes searching his. Her bones were sharp beneath her skin, and her dress had been patched in more places than it hadn't. "Our cabin's small," she said, "and not much to look at." Ellie tugged her mother's hand. "But it's clean. The cleanest in town. Mama scrubs everything till it shines." James nodded slowly. "Well," he said, adjusting his hat and offering his arm, "I reckon I could use some shade, and maybe a glass of water." Ellie beamed. Evelyn looked like she might cry. And as they turned toward the little house at the edge of town, James realized his feet weren't just walking toward shelter, they were walking into something far more dangerous, a life he never meant to find. The cabin sat crouched at the edge of town, like it didn't want to be noticed. It was made of weathered pine, its boards silvered by sun and time. There was no fence, no porch swing, just a single wind chime made from spoons that clinked in the dry wind like a forgotten lullaby. Inside, the air was cooler, but still dry. James ducked through the door and paused. Everything was clean, painstakingly so. The floor was swept, the table scrubbed, the curtains hand-stitched with tiny red flowers. There were no extra chairs, no clutter, and no sign of a man. Only 2 mugs on the shelf, 2 plates, 2 spoons. Evelyn's fingers shook slightly as she poured water into a tin cup and handed it to him. Her smile tried to be polite, but there was too much weariness beneath it. "I'm sorry we can't offer more," she said. "We live small." James took the cup. "Small's fine by me." Ellie hopped onto the only stool near the fire, pulling her knees to her chest. "Mama used to teach reading to the town's children," she offered. "But after Papa died, no one could pay any more." James glanced at Evelyn. Her face tightened for a second before she turned to tend the empty hearth. "Your husband?" he asked softly. "Jonas. He worked in the silver vein up past Ridge Hollow. The mine collapsed last winter." A long pause. "I'm sorry," James said. Evelyn nodded once, as if she'd already heard that too many times. They recovered 6 bodies. His wasn't one of them. But when the earth closes like that, there's no surviving it. James looked down into his cup. He'd seen mines swallow men whole. The ground in these parts had a hunger. Ellie interrupted the silence with a new thread. "After Papa died, Victor Kessler came." James's jaw twitched. Evelyn's voice was low. "He owns the general store, the saloon, 3 boarding houses, and most of the land. People around here call him Mr., but it isn't out of respect. Let me guess." James said, "He lent you money." She nodded, lips pressed tight. $68. For medicine, the kind that doesn't work. But hope is a strong drug. James leaned back slightly. "And now he's calling in the debt." Evelyn's voice grew thin. "He comes by every few days, stands just outside the door and knocks, like he owns the air." Ellie hides. I try to smile, but last time, she stopped. James didn't push, but Ellie filled the silence with childish boldness. Last time he grabbed Mama's arm and told her if she couldn't pay in money, she'd have to pay in other ways. James set down his cup, very carefully. Evelyn looked away. "Ellie, it's true," the girl whispered. James's hands flexed at his sides. He'd met men like Kessler before sharpsuits, cleaner boots than the preacher, and hearts blacker than a burned-out barn. And the Sheriff Evelyn laughed once, no humor in it. "He eats at Kessler's table. He'll fine you for loitering, but not for threats." James glanced at Ellie. Her hands were clenched tight in her lap, trying not to shake. "I don't want charity," Evelyn said suddenly, turning toward him. "I didn't raise Ellie to beg, and I didn't ask her to stop you." "She didn't beg," James said. She reasoned. Evelyn looked startled. She made a case. He continued. "Clear, honest, braver than most grown men." He stood, slowly. Dust fell from his coat in faint puffs. "I can't promise you anything yet," he said. "But I don't like bullies. And I don't run from storms." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You'd stand up to him." James met her gaze. "I've stood up to worse. But it's not about me. It's about what you want." "I want to keep my daughter safe," she whispered. "Then maybe we start there." A knock rattled the door. Ellie gasped. Evelyn's face turned white. James moved before either of them could speak, crossing the room in 2 steps. He didn't draw his gun, but his hand rested near it, fingers steady. Outside, the wind kicked up a swirl of dust. A tall shadow stood on the porch. "Evenin'. Miss Collins," came the voice, smooth, slick, coated in something poisonous. "Kessler." Evelyn breathed. James opened the door just enough to step outside and close it behind him. Victor Kessler smiled, hat tilted, boots polished like a preacher's lie. He was flanked by 2 men who didn't bother pretending to be anything but muscle. Well now, Kessler drawled. Who might you be? Name's Rowan. I'm a guest. Guest Kessler grinned wider. In her house, that makes things complicated. James didn't answer, just stood, back straight. Kessler leaned in. Tell her the debt's due Sunday. No delays. And if she thinks a stranger with calloused hands and no last name will scare me off, she's mistaken. James's voice was calm. Sunday. Huh. Kessler blinked. You'll have your answer before then. He stepped back inside before the dust could settle and closed the door. Evelyn was frozen. What did he say, she asked. James picked up his coat from the chair and dusted it off. He said he'd be back. Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. And what will we do? James looked between them. The mother, the child, one trembling with fear, one trying not to. And for the first time in a long while, he knew what he had to do. We make him regret coming back. The wind picked up after sunset. It whistled through the seams of the cabin, tugging at the corners of the patched curtains and stirring the dried lavender tied along the beams. The scent of it filled the air sharp and soft at once, like memory. James knelt beside the hearth, coaxing a flicker of flame from the kindling Evelyn had stacked with care. The wood was dry, crackling like crumpled paper. It caught quick. The fire danced up the chimney, painting the cabin walls with amber light. Evelyn set out 3 chipped plates too full, one halved for Ellie. She'd made cornbread and something that might have been beans, but James ate like it was a feast. Afterward, she tried to apologize again. I know it's not much. He shook his head. It's warm, and it's real. I've eaten worse on richer plates. Ellie sat cross-legged near the fire, holding a doll that had clearly been mended a dozen times. The yarn hair was coming undone. One button eye had been replaced with a coin, but she rocked it like it was the finest porcelain. She calls her June, Evelyn said softly, noticing his glance. Named after the month we almost had enough to leave this place. Why didn't you? Her eyes dropped. The mine took Jonas 2 weeks before. Silence. James poked at the fire. The flames hissed, catching a stubborn log. She hasn't had anyone to talk to. Evelyn continued, quieter. Not really. The other children drifted away after the collapse, or their parents told them not to come around. He looked up. Because of Kessler, Evelyn nodded. It's not just about what he owns. It's about what he whispers. James leaned back against the wall, letting the warmth ease the knots in his shoulders. For the first time in months, his bones didn't ache from cold or saddle. Ellie's voice rose through the quiet. Do you have a family? Mr. Rowan James blinked. Had, he said, after a moment. A long time ago. What happened? Evelyn started to hush her daughter, but James held up a hand. My wife passed. Fever. In Colorado. Winter of 46. Ellie stared. Solemn. Did you love her? I did. I still do. In a way. Then why are you alone? James exhaled slowly. Because losing someone makes you afraid to find anything again. Even hope. The words surprised him as they came out. Evelyn, seated across the room, watched him like she was seeing through smoke. I know that feeling, she said quietly. Thunder rolled in the distance. James rose and moved to the window. The clouds were thick now, heavy with the kind of storm that didn't just pass through, it lingered. Lightning split the horizon in a jagged white crack. This roof hold up, he asked. Evelyn nodded. So far. As if on cue, a gust of wind slammed against the door. Ellie jumped. James turned back. You ever have to ride out a real desert storm? Evelyn shook her head. Then we ought to make sure the wagon's tied down. He grabbed his coat and moved for the door. Evelyn followed, grabbing the lantern. Outside, the night had turned wild. Dust curled in snarling shapes across the street. Shingles rattled on roofs. The sign above the general store creaked like a gallows. James worked quickly, looping the horse's reins around the porch beam. Hank snorted but stood his ground. Lightning flashed again, this time closer. Back inside. Evelyn shut the door against the wind and dropped the bar across it. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ellie whispered, Is this the kind of storm that washes everything away? James glanced at Evelyn. Sometimes it does, he said. And sometimes it brings things back. They lit the lanterns. Shadows danced across the cabin walls, shadows of people who didn't quite know each other, but already shared something deeper than names. Evelyn moved to the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the kettle. "You all right?" James asked. "I get like this when I'm scared," she admitted. "Been happening more lately." James crossed the room and knelt beside the hearth, close, but not too close. "You've held this place together through things most people wouldn't survive. Don't mistake shaking for weakness. It just means your heart's still trying." Evelyn's lips parted like she might cry, but instead, she gave a single nod. Ellie pulled a blanket over her lap and leaned against the chair. "I used to think storms were bad," she said sleepily, "but Papa said thunder was just God moving furniture." James smiled. "That's a good way to put it." A long silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the tin roof. "Mr. Rowan," Evelyn said at last, "this whole marriage idea. You don't owe us anything. I know. I don't want you to feel trapped. I don't. Then why are you still here?" James stared into the fire. The flames shifted, curling around the logs like fingers. "Because every time I leave somewhere, I wonder if I'm missing the one place I should have stayed. And tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight feels different." Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. The wind howled louder. Thunder cracked like a whip just outside. James stood and gently pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain-lashed window, a figure moved across the street. He froze. A man. Wide shoulders. Dark coat. Hat pulled low. Watching. Then gone. Evelyn moved beside him. "What is it?" James let the curtain fall. Maybe nothing, but he didn't believe that. He reached for the rifle leaning by the door and checked the chamber. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 3 souls sat huddled in a cabin that didn't feel quite as small as it had hours ago. The fire was bright. The air smelled like cornbread and pine smoke. And for a fleeting moment, just one James allowed himself the thought that maybe this wasn't a stop along the way. Maybe this was the reason he'd come west at all. The morning came late. The storm had passed, but it left behind the smell of wet dirt and broken silence. Dust Creek looked softer in the gray light, as if the rain had washed away some of its hardness, though not enough. James sat on the porch, one boot resting on the railing, a tin cup of lukewarm coffee in hand. The horses dozed nearby, tails flicking, content with the cooler air. Inside, Evelyn stirred a pan of oats over the fire. Ellie was still curled beneath the quilt, snoring softly with her doll tucked under one arm. James didn't move. He was staring at the money pouch in his lap. $89. Nearly everything he'd saved in 5 years. Hard-earned coin meant for a piece of land somewhere green, maybe a modest house, a fence, quiet mornings with no debts and no devils like Kessler sniffing at the door, a future. And now he was thinking of trading it for someone else's. Evelyn stepped outside with 2 bowls balanced in her hands. She sat beside him and handed one over. Steam drifted into the air between them. "You've been quiet," she said. He stirred the oats without eating. "I've been thinking about us, about a little girl who stood in the road and asked a stranger to save her mother." Evelyn looked down at her lap. "I'm sorry about that. She was only trying to protect me." "I know," James said. "That's the part that stays with me." They ate in silence. Eventually, she asked, "What are you really doing out here? James Rowan Dust Creek ain't on the way to anywhere." He set the bowl down. "I was heading for California. Plan was to start a freight line out of San Luis Pass. Use the savings. Settle down. Be my own man for once." And now he looked out at the dusty street, at the town still half asleep. "Now I'm not so sure." Just then, Ellie came bounding out the door, barefoot and wide-eyed. "He's here." Both adults rose fast. Kessler James asked. Ellie nodded, pointing down the road, and 2 others. "They're headed to the house." Evelyn went pale. James moved past her, grabbing his coat and gun belt from the post. They met Victor Kessler halfway down the lane. He looked immaculate, as always. His hat was dry, his coat pressed, and his boots gleamed like they hadn't stepped in dust a day in their life. The men beside him looked rougher, one older with a limp, the other young and too eager. Kessler tipped his hat mockingly. "Good morning. Miss Collins. Mr. Rowan. Fine day. Isn't it?" James didn't reply. Kessler held up a folded piece of paper. "Notice of property seizure. Filed this morning with the territorial clerk. If payment isn't made by Sunday sundown, I take possession." Evelyn's voice cracked. "You can't just take our home." "I'm not taking, ma'am," Kessler said smoothly. "I'm collecting." "Debt's a contract, and contracts have consequences." He turned to James. "Now, you seem like a reasonable man. Surely you wouldn't want this fine woman and her child living on the street." James said nothing. His hand was clenched so tight on his belt, his knuckles turned white. Kessler stepped closer. "I hear you've got coin. That you came into town with a wagon full of medicine and plans for the coast." "That right." James met his eyes. "What if it is?" "Well then." Kessler smiled. "Maybe you'd like to trade some of those dreams for a bit of mercy." The word made James flinch. Kessler continued. $68 clears the debt. Add interest, penalties, and my time I'll call it 95. James exhaled through his nose. "That's everything I've got." "Then it's a fair exchange." Evelyn stepped between them, voice trembling. "Don't. You've done enough already." But Ellie clutched his coat sleeve, eyes shining. "Please." James looked at the girl, then the woman, then at Kessler, and then he reached into his coat and pulled out the pouch. Kessler's eyes lit up as the coins hit his palm. Gold, silver, copper, a lifetime in a single clatter. He counted them slowly, deliberately. "Well now, look at that. Paid in full." James didn't move. He just stared as Kessler folded the notice and slipped it back into his pocket. "Of course," Kessler added, "this doesn't mean I won't be watching. Sometimes debts come back around. In other forms." James stepped forward, lowering his voice to a growl. "You ever set foot on this land again, I'll make sure you limp for the rest of your days." Kessler's smile faltered just a little. He tipped his hat and turned. James watched them walk away, three shadows shrinking down a sunlit road. Evelyn stood behind him, trembling. "You didn't have to do that. I know. You gave up your whole future." James turned to her. "No. I traded it for something better." Inside, Ellie sat at the table, arms wrapped tight around her doll. When she saw James step through the doorway, she jumped up. "Does this mean you're really going to marry Mama?" James looked at Evelyn. Her lips parted, and for a second, he saw every emotion flicker across her face. Fear, gratitude, hope, and something dangerously close to trust. He knelt beside Ellie. "I gave away my savings, little one, so I reckon I'm staying a while." Ellie beamed. "Then you're already part of our family." Sunday came hot and bright, as if the storm had never touched the town at all. Dust Creek shimmered beneath the sun like a mirage. The streets were dry again, but tension still hung in the air, thin, invisible, and everywhere. People peeked from behind curtains as James Rowan adjusted the collar of his only clean shirt. It didn't fit right. He hadn't worn it in years. Evelyn stood on the cabin's front step in a faded green dress. It had once been her Sunday best, though the color had dulled and the stitching had been mended so many times it told its own story. Still, in the early light, it made her look taller somehow. Softer, braver. Ellie twirled in a circle beside her, arms stretched, pretending she was scattering flower petals. Her hair had been braided into two neat ropes, and her cheeks were flushed with something between joy and nerves. "You ready?" James asked. Evelyn hesitated, then gave a small, firm nod. "As I'll ever be." They walked slowly down the main street, side by side. The buildings felt too quiet. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a shutter creaked lazily in the wind. But no one spoke. Just silence, like the town itself was holding its breath. At the end of the street stood the little church. Its white paint had peeled in long, lazy curls, and the bell tower leaned slightly to the right, like a tired man resting his weight. But the doors were open, and inside stood Reverend Alden Tall, thin, with hands like driftwood and eyes that had seen too much. "You sure about this?" he asked softly as they stepped inside. "No," James said. "But I'm here." Reverend Alden nodded. "That'll do." There were no guests, no piano, no flowers, just 3 people standing beneath a cracked wooden cross and shafts of light that fell through warped window panes. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she took James's. He could feel the calluses on her fingers, the kind that came from scrubbing floors, lifting pails, mending endlessly for a child too young to be alone. He squeezed them gently, offering what steadiness he had left. Ellie stood just off to the side, holding her doll like it was an honored guest. Her eyes didn't leave the couple not once. The Reverend cleared his throat. "We gather today, not in grand halls, but in truth." He began. 2 souls, weary and weathered, choosing to walk forward, not because love struck like lightning, but because kindness did. His voice echoed slightly in the empty space. "There is no ring," he asked. James shook his head. "Just a promise." "That'll do," the Reverend said again, then turned to Evelyn. "Do you, Evelyn Collins, take this man to be your partner in shelter and storm, in burden and in small, hard-won joy?" Evelyn's voice came soft, but clear. "I do." He turned to James. "And do you, James Rowan, take this woman and the child she brings with her, not as weight to bear, but as family to belong to?" James didn't hesitate. "I do." "Then by the laws of this town and the quiet, watching grace of heaven," the Reverend said, "you are joined." He looked between them. "You may. We'll shake hands," James interrupted, glancing sideways at Evelyn with a wry smile. She let out a small laugh, a sound so unfamiliar on her lips it startled her, but she extended her hand. Their fingers met in a firm, deliberate clasp. Ellie clapped, her doll bouncing in her arms. Best wedding ever. They walked out together, James, Evelyn, and Ellie, into the sunlight. Dust still curled in the air. The town was still quiet, but something had changed. A door opened, then another. A woman on a porch gave the smallest of nods, a man tipping his hat behind a window, and from somewhere unseen, someone began to hum a hymn, not loud, not even fully in tune, but enough to carry through the dry morning air like hope stitched into the wind. James glanced at Evelyn as they passed back toward the cabin. "I know this wasn't the wedding you dreamed of," he said. "I stopped dreaming of weddings a long time ago," she replied. Then, after a pause, "But this feels like a beginning I can believe in." James nodded. "That'll do." And for the first time since he'd stepped into Dust Creek, he allowed himself to imagine something more than survival. He imagined staying. The wind shifted at sundown. It came low and hot, carrying the scent of dust and trouble. James stood at the woodpile behind the cabin, stacking fresh-cut logs near the door, when he noticed it, the silence. No crickets, no birds, just a stillness that didn't belong. Inside, Evelyn was humming while stirring a pot of beans. Ellie giggled as she tried to braid her doll's tangled yarn hair. The sound of them ordinary, domestic, alive, settled something inside James. For a moment, it felt like peace. And then the knock came. 3 hard, deliberate strikes on the door, like thunder that hadn't waited for the sky's permission. James crossed the room without a word, hand on his belt. He opened the door slow. Victor Kessler filled the doorway like a shadow with teeth. His black coat was buttoned high, and his eyes gleamed with the sort of satisfaction reserved for men who enjoy setting fires more than watching them burn. "Well now," Kessler said smoothly, "you really went and did it." Evelyn stepped behind James. "We were married this morning. Reverend Alden signed the papers." Kessler smiled wide. "That's adorable. Problem is, I filed a counterclaim last night. Legal injunction. Until your debts are reviewed, you're restricted from entering any binding contract, including marriage." James's jaw flexed. "You're too late. Maybe," Kessler said. "Maybe not. I've also filed a motion to have Mrs. Collins declared Ward of the territory unfit to handle her affairs. "That's a lie," Evelyn whispered, voice shaking. "Lies move fast in small towns," Kessler replied, "especially when the sheriff owes you favors." Behind him, two men waited, one leaning against the porch beam, the other tapping a finger on the grip of his revolver. Ellie squeezed Evelyn's hand. Her doll clutched so tight the stuffing peeked through the seam. James stepped forward. "Whatever you're here for, say it plain." Kessler leaned in. "You've embarrassed me, Mr. Rowan, publicly. That costs more than money." He paused, then added, almost gently, "You could still walk away. I'll even let her keep the cabin for a while, but you stay, and things will get harder for all of you." James didn't blink. "I'm not going anywhere." Kessler's smile vanished. "I'll remember that," he said, then turned to Evelyn. "So will the court." He stepped down off the porch, his coat flaring in the wind. The other men followed silently. They didn't ride out of town. They walked slowly like they had all the time in the world. James closed the door behind them. The click of the latch echoed too loudly. Evelyn leaned against the wall, as if her knees couldn't hold her anymore. "What have we done?" James moved to the window and parted the curtain. Kessler's silhouette disappeared into the dusk, swallowed by orange and shadow. "We bought time," he said. "Now we figure out how to keep it." Ellie sat quietly on the rug, tracing patterns in the firelight with her fingers. "He'll come back, won't he?" James nodded. "He always does." That night, no one slept much. Evelyn tried. She lay on the cot, staring at the beams, hands folded over her stomach like she was waiting to be buried. Ellie curled up beside her, thumb in her mouth, whispering made-up prayers, and James sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the night breathe. Hours passed. At one point, Evelyn spoke into the dark. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" James didn't answer at first. "I thought I'd find peace under open skies. Turns out, peace looks more like a kitchen table and two people who won't quit." He heard her shift, the soft creak of cotton sheets. "I never wanted to depend on anyone, and I never thought anyone would." He turned and looked toward her, their faces barely lit by the dying fire. "But here we are," he said. She nodded once. "Here we are." Thunder grumbled low in the distance. The wind rattled the shutters once, then stilled, and the three of them waited for morning, for whatever came next, for the storm that hadn't quite left Dust Creek. The next morning came sharp and clear, like a knife had cut the sky open. James woke with a crick in his neck and the taste of old fear on his tongue. Evelyn was already at the stove, stirring what little coffee grounds remained. Ellie yawned behind him, blanket still clutched in her fists like armor. No one said it out loud, but the cabin felt different, heavier, quieter, like the air itself was waiting. "I can't keep doing this," Evelyn said softly, pouring coffee into a cracked mug, looking over my shoulder, sleeping with one eye open. "You won't have to," James replied. She turned, eyes narrowed. "What do you mean I'm going to town?" "To talk." "To the sheriff?" she asked, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "To everyone." Evelyn blinked. "They won't help. They're scared. They always have been." James finished his coffee and stood. "Then it's time they remember who Dust Creek belongs to." He went to the blacksmith first. Old Marius had arms like tree trunks and hands that looked carved from iron. He barely looked up from the horseshoe he was hammering. "I need you," James said. Marius grunted. "Not in the business of dying for strangers." James didn't flinch. "But what about dying for neighbors, for a town that used to stand for something?" Marius looked up, eyes shadowed. "What do you want? Just your hammer. And your word." Then James walked to the saloon, to the general store, to the laundry, the livery, the boarding house. He knocked on doors. He looked people in the eye. He didn't ask them to fight. He asked them to choose. By midday, he stood in front of the church with nearly 24 behind him. Not all carried guns. Most just carried tired hands, worn boots, and the shared memory of what it felt like before fear settled in. Sheriff Lyle came last. His badge looked dusty. His mouth looked dry. "Kessler'll come down on you," he muttered. "On all of us." James nodded. "Then let him. But he won't come down on just one of us anymore." Lyle looked around at the miners, the women, the preacher, the schoolteacher whose husband had vanished after refusing one of Kessler's offers, and then the sheriff took off his hat and said, "All right." They didn't march. They didn't shout. They just stood like fence posts planted into hard earth, waiting outside Kessler's office. The door creaked open around mid-afternoon. Victor Kessler stood in the frame, sleeves rolled, glass of bourbon in one hand. Behind him, the shadows of his hired men lingered like grease on water. "Well," he drawled, "looks like I've attracted a crowd." James stepped forward. "You've leeched off this town long enough. That ends now." Kessler laughed, slow and mean. "You gonna run me out? With what, pitchforks and prayer?" "No," said James. "With truth. With people who stopped being afraid." The townsfolk didn't move. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any bullet. Reverend Alden stepped forward with a folded paper. "This is a statement from Dust Creek, signed by every family. We're filing it with the territory. A formal petition of misconduct, false debt collection, coercion, threat." Kessler's grin twitched. James leaned in. "We've got copies in every wagon heading west. Try to burn one. 10 more show up." Kessler's hand twitched near his belt, and then Ellie stepped forward from behind the crowd, from beside her mother. She didn't say anything, just stood tall. For a second, no one breathed. Then Kessler stepped back, slammed the door, and didn't come out. That evening, the town gathered under a sky full of stars. Someone played a fiddle. Someone else lit lanterns. A pot of stew was passed around, and no one asked who'd brought it. James sat on the steps of the church, legs stretched out, watching Ellie dance barefoot in the dust. Evelyn sat beside him, knees close enough to touch. "You did it," she said. "No," he replied. "We did." She smiled small, tired, but real. For the first time in a long while, she whispered, "I think we might be safe." James didn't answer right away. He just watched the light on Ellie's face. Then, softly, he said, "Not just safe. Home." The next morning came soft and slow, with golden light dripping through the cabin windows like honey. James woke to the scent of coffee and the quiet rustle of someone moving near the stove. Evelyn stood barefoot on the wooden floor, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, pouring hot water over the last grounds they had. She moved with a kind of quiet certainty now, the weight she'd carried for years finally beginning to lift. Ellie sat cross-legged on the rug, brushing her doll's hair with a stick she'd whittled smooth. The smile on her face was simple, carefree, in a way James hadn't seen since the day she stepped into the road and asked a stranger to marry her mother. And now, he wasn't a stranger. James rose from his bedroll and folded the blanket carefully. When he stood, Evelyn turned and smiled. "Did you sleep?" He nodded. "Well enough." She poured him a cup and handed it over. Their fingers touched, just briefly, but neither of them pulled away. Outside, the air was crisp, and for the first time in weeks, the wind felt like a promise instead of a warning. The town was quieter than usual, but not out of fear. The silence now felt like exhale, like release. After breakfast, James walked to the edge of the property and looked out across Dust Creek. The hills in the distance were still tinged with gray, but the road that led away from town no longer called to him the way it once did. He belonged here now. He turned to find Evelyn beside him, her shawl wrapped tight against the breeze. "Would you still be here?" she asked. If Ellie hadn't stopped you that day, he didn't answer right away. He looked at her, at the woman who had lost nearly everything and still managed to create something warm, something clean and alive from ashes. "I don't think I would have stopped," he admitted, "but I think I was waiting for a reason to." She smiled gently. "I think we all were." James reached for her hand. This time, she took it without hesitation. Ellie burst through the door then, boots half-laced, her arms full of small wildflowers. "Look," she cried, holding them out. The hills blooming again. Evelyn knelt down, touching the soft petals. "Spring always comes," she whispered, half to herself. James looked at them, mother and daughter, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the aching pull of longing, not the distant pain of remembering someone lost. something steadier, warmer, something like hope. As the sun climbed higher and the air began to hum with life again, James knew this was no longer a temporary stop, no longer a quiet kindness in passing. This was the beginning, and beginnings, he'd come to understand, were always disguised as endings. That evening, as the stars returned and lanterns flickered in windows across Dust Creek, James sat beside Evelyn on the porch with Ellie sleeping in a quilt at their feet. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Some families are born. Others are built patiently, painfully, and against the odds. But the ones built from love, from courage, from choosing each other day after day, those are the ones that last. And James Rowan, the man who once lived for the road, finally knew what it meant to stay. Sometimes, the people who need us most are not the ones who call out the loudest, but the ones who stand quietly, desperately, at the edge of the road. Real strength isn't in how far we can run or how long we can survive alone. It's in choosing to show up for someone else when it matters most. In a world that often teaches us to keep moving, there is deep beauty in the choice to stay, to build, to become someone's safe place. That choice can change a life. Sometimes, it can change yours too. If this story moved you even just a little, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us, what would you have done if you were James Rowan, and if you believe in the power of kindness, healing, and storytelling that touches the heart. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another journey like this one. Thank you for walking this road with us. We'll meet again in the next story.